Okay, good morning, everybody. It's 1 minute past 11. Welcome to this event, which is the latest in the series we are running in partnership with Policy at Manchester, focused on devolution. Today's event is called What Does the COVID-19 Roadmap Mean for Cities and City Regions? As we all know, the government has set out its roadmap, which could see all COVID restrictions lifted as early as the 21st of June this year, not so long into the future. As we take stock of the huge impact of the pandemic and its associated restrictions have had, raises questions about what are the economic challenges for cities and towns as they seek to recover from the crisis. What will the COVID recovery mean for economic development plans and local industrial strategies if they still exist? More of the same or something completely different? And can our local leaders bring about the change that their places need? What should government be doing to support them? So these and many more are some of the questions that we will be exploring today with our panel, and I'll introduce them very shortly. But as always, just a few words of housekeeping. The event is being recorded and will be made available on our website after the event. During the event, please keep your microphones on mute. If you want to tweet about the event, the hashtag is CFC Roadmap. There will be opportunities for questions to the panel after they've made their opening remarks. You can submit your questions at any time. You don't have to wait until they have finished. And you do this by sending a question via the chat function to ask a question. When we get to questions, we do like you to ask some of the questions, so be prepared. And if you prefer me to read them out, then just let us know when you post it, and we will be done and dusted by 12 o'clock. So without further ado, let me introduce my esteemed panel. Our first panelist is Andy Westwood. Andy is Professor of Government Practice and Vice Dean of Social Responsibility at the University of Manchester. Our second panelist is Kate Ingram. Kate is Head of Regeneration and Planning at Burnley Council. Our third panelist is Julia Goldsworthy. Julia is the Director of Strategy at West Midlands Combined Authority. And our fourth panelist is Paul Swinney. Paul is my colleague and Director of Policy and Research at the Centre for Cities. Each of them will set out their stall for a few minutes, and then we'll dive into the detail of the questions that you have and we have of each other. So without further ado, Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew, and thanks to everybody at the Centre for Cities for organising today's event. It's I hope it's going to be a really interesting one. For my kind of opening thoughts, I mean, obviously the question, what does this timetable mean? I mean, the first issue is that it now feels like we're firmly on one, and that feels like a big step in itself. But I think as far as this discussion is concerned, it means that we can return to something closer to normality in the way that we are thinking about cities and towns and their futures. Though of course, there's already an industry thinking about what the full impact of COVID is going to have been on both cities and towns within our regions, over the kind of short, medium, and longer term. But normality in one sense will involve, I think, thinking about obviously how places recover and grow, and the growth part of that is certainly something that certainly all of us on this call are familiar with, and that's against kind of a very familiar backdrop, and the recovery is going to reinforce that familiar backdrop, which is one of inter and intra-regional inequality, low productivity in the majority of our city regions, which remains perhaps one of the biggest challenges that we still face. And so, this is a kind of normality that's about economics and politics. They're not the same, and we should accept that these aren't necessarily the same, even though they overlap. And as far as city regions are concerned, when we get to the mayoral elections and kind of the campaigns are just about to kick off, we know that they must involve both. I want to kind of think briefly about kind of towns and the surrounding regions from cities for a second, and I really like the analysis that Andres Rodriguez Pose at the LSC kind of talks about when he describes in a great paper, The Revenge of Places That Don't Matter. I'd recommend it to everybody, because electorally, of course they matter. And you know, in any campaign, you have to prove that they matter. And that matters when you come to tot up the votes in the elections, just as you do, and this is kind of the point of his paper, just as you do when you come to tot up the results in a referendum or in general elections. So you know, that backdrop is there. Other things are obviously already shifting, including the sort of policy response to that at a national level. The plan for growth, which was published alongside the budget a couple of weeks ago, is essentially our kind of starting place, I think. The slightly bad news is that it replaces the industrial strategy, and you know, and that's probably more about replacing the mindset rather than the detail. It sort of heralds a return, I think, to a treasury dominance in thinking about growth rather than a kind of industrial strategy based one, and a treasury focus on things that it finds familiar, such as fixing the supply side, you know, wanting to kind of grow and reinforce a world-class, well-performing centre in each region and nation. But the Treasury, you know, the Treasury is very keen on fixing the supply side. So there's lots on skills and infrastructure and innovation and R&D. And then some added bits are around kind of, you know, the added politics of global Britain post-Brexit and, of course, levelling up. I do think, though, the industrial strategy is not something we should completely leave behind, even if the language disappears. But we need to be careful about it. Ottilie Laser, the chief executive UKRI, is very keen to say that R&D can't just be something that happens somewhere else. And so, you know, we need to think when we set about fixing the supply side that R&D skills and infrastructure, you know, need to tell a compelling story and deliver tangible outcomes across regions rather than just in particular parts of them. But in terms of the industrial strategy language and kind of, you know, the reality of it, you know, we still need to be thinking about gigafactories and graphene, and about potentially reshoring PPE, vaccine manufacturing, and, you know, generally how we support and grow supply chains in places across, you know, places like Manchester, Greater Manchester, and the West Midlands. I want to kind of move from Manchester to the West Midlands for a minute, not least because, as many of you will know, I'm from Wolverhampton. So thinking of that as an example, I'm still not sure whether it's a small city or a large town in identity terms. But you know, you can see some of those contradictions and tensions in a place like Wolverhampton. You know, it's got fantastic new kind of station and transport investment, connectivity really matters. It's got a new National Brownfield Institute, so there's some R&D coming through, and it's got 500 new jobs from the Department for Communities and Local Government. All of these are good, although we do, if we're honest, tend to be a bit sniffy about the last of those, in the same way that we are, academics in particular, sniffy about the impact of employment zones, enterprise zones, or free ports, if you like. But I think the reason why I want to talk about Wolverhampton was kind of, you know, how do you campaign in a place like Wolverhampton? Well, you also have to talk about, and you also should talk about, things like Beatties, you know, the department store that kind of turned into a Debenhams and is now a hulking wreck on the or a smoking ruin in Dominic Cummings' language on the high street. You talk about pubs, you talk about identity, and I think, you know, this is good politics to do that, and it's entirely legitimate as political strategy because these things matter. But we get ourselves in a bit of a muddle when we think about political strategy being the same thing as economic strategy. They're not. Although sometimes I think people confuse them as the same. And there are similar stories, you know, there are Wolverhamptons everywhere. Well, I like to think so. You know, in Greater Manchester, it might be a conversation about Oldham or Rochdale, or in West Yorkshire, Huddersfield or Wakefield. If anyone hasn't listened to Anand Menon's documentary on Radio 4, they should. about Wakefield. But but going back to the Rodriguez Pose stuff, how do you deal with those places that don't matter? He talks a lot about the importance of trajectory. There needs to be a story, a positive story of change and development, but and identity and symbolism matters in that. And so I know that, to finish, I know that skills and human capital, R&D and infrastructure are vital. Fixing the supply side and the treasury approach is vital. Like Julia, I'm an ex-treasury member of staff, so I get that and I believe that. But I also know these are long haul issues because we start from a low base in all of those. But other things matter too. And I guess what I'm saying is that, I think we can be overly cynical about some of the bits that make up the levelling up announcements, the high street stuff, the levelling up fund, and there are problems with the way it's being rolled out and places are being targeted. I get that. But in terms of how it targets trajectory and symbolism and things that matter politically, I think we should be more accepting of that as a strategy. And I think in cities and regions, as we kind of plan recovery, we really need to think about the economics and politics together, as well as thinking about the regional centres and the kind of towns and surrounding areas that sit beyond our major cities. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Andy. I look forward to kind of comments on whether Wolverhampton is a city or a town, but I'm not gonna go there given our history on those kind of things. But I think interesting points about the economics and the politics. One of the things I think we might want to explore is whether we feel that the wedge that can occur between economics and politics has got bigger over time, and therefore it needs to be reconciled, and how we might do that. But I think that would be a really interesting area to explore when we get to questions. But let's move to Kate. Kate, give us the view from Burnley. What are you up to, and what do you need in order to be successful in the future? Kate, over to you.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks for inviting us along to this session. It's good to be here. In terms of the roadmap, I think like Andy Westwood mentioned, I think, it's good news. It gives us all a sense of optimism and some sort of light at the end of the tunnel. Up here in Burnley, we've had some kind of restrictions in place since August last year. It's been a tough haul, it really has. But actually, it is only the start, isn't it? It is very much, I see it as a tactical plan for the next 3 months on how we reopen a very specific part of our economy, mainly retail and hospitality. And it needs to be done. They're big employers. It's a big part of our economy nationally and locally as well. But there's still a lot of uncertainty even within that 12-week time frame. We're very close to the ground as a district council, so we're finding it difficult to advise businesses actually what it will mean for them in a very practical sense over the next few weeks. And everyone's got this 20th of June date in their mind, as though everything's going to return to normal. It isn't, and we are very realistic about that. And actually, we started doing some work around recovery and putting together our own roadmap last summer. And actually, we have a 5-year roadmap for all the reasons that Andy's just pointed out. This pandemic has really made us look very closely. It has really shone a light, I think, on some of the key underlying issues around our economy. So just going back, there's a whole load of practical things we need to do over the next 3 months to get that part of the economy growing. What happens on the 20th of June? Is everyone going to go back to normal? Is everyone going to return to the office? And I guess that's a bigger question for some of those big cities, big regional cities. For us, it's not a big question. All our data and the Centre for Cities tracker data has been really helpful in that our footfall hasn't fallen away significantly. Spend's been good because we do supply more of a local market. We're not reliant on that daily commute into our town centres. And actually, if all those big city Manchester-based companies go to a blended, working practice, in the future, towns like Burnley, Rochdale, Oldham, those peripheral places where people live, it's a real opportunity for us to bring new spend, new services into those places. So that's an opportunity for us, I think. But more widely, this hasn't just been a pandemic that's affected our retail and hospitality sector. It's had huge implications across the manufacturing sector. Not all of the manufacturing sector, a big employer in this part of the world, and it will be down in the Midlands as well. If we look at aviation, the civil air aviation sector is looking at a 3 to 4 year recovery period. That is a huge issue for us, not just in Burnley, but the whole of Lancashire. We are very dependent on aerospace, the aerospace sector. Some of that slack in the civil aviation sector has fortunately been taken up by, a very buoyant defence sector. But if sometime over the next 3 to 4 years, that defence work falls away, then we have some real issues. I think going forward, and Andy mentioned that the whole piece around R&D, the kind of aircraft we'll be building and the kind of cars that we'll be building will be very different. And I think actually the pandemic is probably going to hasten the transformation of those sectors. And whilst there's lots of focus, I think, on the big picture around green vehicles, green aircraft, low carbon aircraft, for us the big question is, how does that then come down into the supply chain and to those smaller mid-cap companies that are the lifeblood of our economy here. And I think whilst that, I was talking to a business yesterday, for example, and we've got real concerns that actually that some businesses don't have much fuel left in their tank to recover. Have they got the capital to reinvest if they get opportunities to go on to new platforms and so on? And going forward, is there going to be an issue around lending in particular? A lot of businesses took on a lot of debt last year in terms of the CBILS, which at the time was welcome, but I don't think anybody really expected to be in this situation for so long. And I think time will tell what the response is around banking to increased indebtedness in business, and that's a concern for us. And I think, when we started looking at our road plan, we actually realised that there were lots of things that we were already working on, that we already knew were key weaknesses in our economy, and particularly here around skills, educational attainment, and what the pandemic has really brought home to us is those health inequalities as well. Those three things are very linked. I mean, it's no coincidence that we've had consistently high infection rates. We've had some of the highest mortality rates in the country in these northern towns. So for us, part of our recovery plan is actually building the resilience of our communities to economic health shocks. And that's a very long-term process that we are committed to. In terms of the policy response, I mean, that the announcements in the budget were welcome. I can spend £20 million of levelling up money 10 times over, but it's not long term enough, is it? We really do need a much more longer term approach to this. Disappointing that the industrial strategy, I did have concerns about the industrial strategy. I don't think it perhaps came down to a local level in quite the way it should have done, but it did at least recognise that industry was important, and it is, and we need to keep a focus on that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed, Kate. I mean, again, loads actually touching on issues that we've explored before. Your points about recognizing the critical interlinkages between health and the economy. We had a session on that a couple of weeks ago, and that's actually quite critical in many places, in the sense the best economic response or intervention may actually be a health one in some respects, to give people a chance to benefit from economic activity if and when it returns. But also, I think your point of caution about maybe an overemphasis on, understandably, but an overemphasis on the short-term recovery that hopefully happens as the lockdown eases may then ultimately mean that, you know, we don't prioritize and focus on some of those bigger, longer-term challenges that you were talking about, but also Andy started with, which is, you know, that they were there before the pandemic and they'll be there afterwards. So lots again to think about. But let's go to our third panelist, Julia Goldsworthy from the West Midlands Combined Authority. Julia, over to you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And really just wanted to start by echoing that theme that in the short term, you know, we might have a roadmap for a guide to how we think restrictions might be lifted, but we should be absolutely planning for that to be quite a bumpy road in the short term. And Kate's right, we absolutely now need to just start thinking about how we approach the longer term. Just to Andy's point, I think Wolverhampton is both a city and a town at the same time, just conscious that it receives the Stronger Towns Fund as well. So I think it definitely has a foot in both camps and is quite happy to
hedging your bets on that one, Julia. You're just hedging your bets on that.
So I suppose I'll just talk more from an organisational point of view, how we've worked together, what that means for how we're planning for the future, and how we engage with people. So I think, you know, before we look forward, just look back and look at the acute response in the West Midlands to the COVID pandemic over the last year. And actually, you know, it's been a real test of the partnership in the region, and it's also helped strengthen some of those bonds. So from an economic point of view, we stood up a weekly economic impact group to give us real-time intelligence and feedback on what was happening on the ground, to enable us and partners to coordinate their response and deliver some of those messages back to government on what the reality was like, as opposed to some of the announcements. We're approaching our 50th week this week. So just really, you know, it's a long time to be in that acute response mode. There's been brilliant collaboration on community recovery. So the local authorities and the combined authority have come together in producing that community recovery plan with really great citizen engagement led by our Director of Public Services Reform, Ed Cox. And, you know, we were also absolutely in that tactical space of kind of working out what are the investments that we can mobilise quickly that will help us speed into recovery quickly. And that was something we did a year ago. We've made some good progress on that, but there's a whole ton of stuff in that document that is a really useful guide for the short-term tactical things that we can do just to kind of help fire the economic engine. I mean, it's absolutely not been perfect. It has been messy. It's been people pulling together to do what they can, but I really think it's cemented relationships, and that is going to be so important going forward. We absolutely are going to need that collaboration, because we know that recovery is going to take a long time and it's going to be tough. So, you know, we told a really great story as a region on our economy prior to COVID hitting, you know, strongest performing region outside London, you know, really, really good progress on productivity. But we all know that there were some serious structural issues underlying that which still hadn't been fully tackled. And we know that COVID has made inequalities worse. It's kind of exposed risks in sectors massively. We know that the combination of Brexit and COVID means that the West Midlands is particularly exposed. So we know there are some really, really difficult things to work through, and the impacts are absolutely uneven across the region and not necessarily in expected ways. So there is a kind of city versus town split potentially, but actually some of the most affluent bits of the broader region, so Stratford in particular, has been absolutely hammered. Maybe from a higher base, but in a really, really difficult position. And I think there's that, you know, even at a neighbourhood level, I think thinking about recovery, we just need to be so careful that we're not broadening inequalities and creating kind of, you know, even deeper pockets of deprivation. So the work we're doing at the moment is really, rather than trying to come up with a lovely shiny document that says here's our solution, is really just start to build a framework for how we'll work together going forward. And the start of that is actually going to our CA board this Friday, and it's really just starting to socialise, like, what are the key shared challenges that we just need to focus our efforts around. And we've tried to boil that down into 5 challenges. They're pretty broad, and there'll be different levels of maturity of activity sitting underneath it, but it's just to structure the ongoing conversation. So one is around future jobs. So that is absolutely around some of the kind of supply side issues, some of the challenges we had in the region around skills, but it's also the massive challenge that will be there for our businesses. How do we help them invest their way out, create the demand for jobs? We know we have big challenges with their absorptive capacity. We have to fix that now more than ever. Another piece just around tackling inequalities. I've talked a bit about it, but we know that this is an absolutely massive challenge, and it's one that's going to have to be tackled across the whole system rather than just by any one institution. Our green ambitions is another huge challenge. Kate talked about it being an opportunity. It absolutely is. But if we're going to deliver our net zero ambitions by 2041, there is an absolutely massive job to mobilise the region and the economy to deliver that. There's a generational piece as well. So, how do we avoid our young people being blighted? We saw some of that in the kind of the fallout of the 2008 financial crash. If anything, it's even more challenging this time around, because it's a much broader range of young people. It's people who are in school now rather than people just entering the workforce, whose life chances are potentially impacted. And I think there's maybe a generational challenge at the older end of the age spectrum too. We've got older people who have lost their jobs. It's going to be much, much more difficult for them. And then finally, kind of how do we approach supporting our communities and places to recovery, and recognise that it's going to be a different set of interventions required for different places. So how we tackle those challenges is going to rely just so much on how we deploy the resources that we already have in the region, as well as what we need from government. And we have to be prepared to work in different ways on different things, have different conversations. And we've just got to share resources in different ways, and we've got to be absolutely relentless in our pursuit of shared outcomes. So that's got to be the tone of where we go next. We've seen some really interesting work in the region actually, in some of that more informal space, getting us out of kind of all of the incentives to get into a transactional space. So across the 3 cities, so that does include Wolverhampton, Andy, some really interesting exploratory, really informal discussions happening just to understand what's going on. It's been brilliantly informed by some of the Centre for Cities analysis, but just to understand where are there common experiences that we can think about how we respond to together, where are there points of difference, how do we understand the interaction with places. So really, really interesting work. And I would say also amazing optimism. I think, the scale of the challenge also means you've got kind of license to be completely creative about what comes next. So I think if you look at some of the emerging place plans, there's, they're getting into things that this time 18 months ago, it would have definitely gone into the too difficult bucket. Whereas there's stuff on, there's stuff that can be put on the table now, which I think is really fantastic. And I think all of that is happening, it feels like, despite, not because of the government environment. It is a very atomized, fragmented, competitive environment where we don't really know what levelling up means, other than possibly spreading existing jam in a slightly different way. And I think for me, my biggest concern with the plan for growth, which actually I think is the more important forward-looking thing than the roadmap, is just like where place fits into all of that. And there's definitely a view where you could say, this is where devolution should sit, and I know where I sit on that in that side of the argument. But actually, it's not an argument about devolution. Just like the prior question is, where is place? Because if government is going to successfully support a recovery, then we need to understand how resources and investment come together in a place, and how we deliver maximum impact from them. And it just feels like that is a really difficult conversation to stitch together, and I don't see where that perspective is being held, basically. So from my point of view, absolutely devolution is an answer. I would recommend taking a look at a rival event happening right now from the Commission for Smart Government, just the output of it, Andrew, obviously. But that is basically just saying, central government does not need to equate control with agency. Actually, they are better able to deliver their outcomes if they unleash the power of places. That is an argument that absolutely needs to be made. But the prior one is, how are you going to see how all this stuff stitches together? so that we can help you and our people, you know, to get the best possible outcome from that longer term recovery.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Julia. Obviously, one of the benefits of the Zoom dominated world is now you can stay here, listen to this conversation, and then watch the recording of that event at your leisure. So don't feel you have to immediately leave and go and find out what Julia is referring to. Stay here with us. There's lots more to come. Fascinating, again, insights. And actually, we had Becca Riley on a couple of weeks ago, Julia, talking about what's been going on in your patch about the weekly updates, which she was on her knees talking about, said she needed a rest. But again, some linkages to previous, but also, again, a curious, interesting about the stickiness of these new working behaviors and patterns. And, you know, are we confident that they will last? Let's hear from my colleague Paul, and then we'll open it up to questions. We've had quite a few already, but if there's more to come, please submit them and we'll get to them as best as we can. Paul, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Andrew. So lots have been said out there that I think we would agree with. So I'll not talk for too long, but add just a little bit extra. So the first thing to say is that I think Centre for Cities is pretty hopeful that we will see a fairly swift bounce back. We don't think we'll see that swift bounce back everywhere, but we do think we'll see it in the majority of our cities. And for those of you who've seen Cities Outlook 2021, which we published in January, we set out why that's the case and which cities are best placed to bounce back and which ones aren't. But clearly, I think the reason why we think there'll be that bounce back is because we've had an element of the economy that's continued to work from home. So that's ticked over. We've had an element of the economy which has been forced to shut down. But that is not shut down because actually there's no business. It's shut down because of government restrictions. And we think that when those restrictions are lifted, demand will return again. Now, the question is, what will that look like across the country? But if the patterns that we saw last summer are anything to go by in terms of when restrictions were lifted the first time, and again, you can see that those on our high street tracker to see how they've played out. What it would suggest is that in small and medium-sized places, we'll see a return back to the high street in terms of spending, but in large places, perhaps we won't see such a quick bounce back. So I think that leaves us with three questions in terms of trying to monitor what's going on as we follow this roadmap, and hopefully we'll stick to it and there aren't any significant bumps in the road between now and the summer. The first one is, how quickly will people go back to the shops? That seems to be what the media are interested in particular, and we'll be tracking that. So please do keep an eye on our website. For big cities and big city centres in particular, I think the more pertinent question, which has been raised by a number of panellists already, is how quickly will people actually go back to the office? And we'll not see people going back to the shops, bars, restaurants, etc., of big city centres in particular, unless we see that return to the office. Very interested to see how that plays out. We think they will return. Question is how quickly. And the third one is, what's going on in terms of forced saving? Because this is an idea that's been, or a data point which has been raised a number of times now, which is because we haven't been spending money, there's been all this forced saving going on, and people are just sitting on piles of cash ready to spend it. Well, within that element, which sort of plays into the inequality debate that we've had so far today, we suspect that it's richer people that have had that forced saving, and actually the sort of poor end of society has not had that forced saving. So in terms of people willing to go out and spend, we think rich people will be keen to do that. But the question is, what will have happened to the bottom end of the labour market? What will have happened to the bottom end of the income distribution? And those people at that bottom end, is it the case that the extension of the universal credit uplift will be enough for them? And what have we got to be doing in the longer term as we emerge from this crisis, as we start to recover, about making sure that we are bringing that part of society along with us? And I think that's a big question that hasn't been answered as yet. In terms of policy for the recovery, well, I think probably what we need to do is to try and, if the money is there, in aggregate at least, if not across all the different parts of society, is about trying to encourage people out again. So that's a question about whether you do a high street spending voucher in the style of Eat Out to Help Out, as happened last year, to encourage people to go back. We should be guided by the data for that. And what we should be doing about trying to make people feel comfortable about going to the office again, if indeed they are going to go back, or both in terms of being in the office itself, but also in terms of public transport usage. And it feels that there's a lot to be done around that, about making people feel comfortable again, about being sort of in large crowds once it's safe to do so within city centres in order to get the economy firing. Now, that's important, I think, not just for the economy writ large, but it's particularly important for those jobs in what we would just sort of call high street type businesses in city centres of bigger cities in particular, which tend to be low skills, tend to be done by low skilled people. if we're going to see those people who are currently on furlough or indeed have been made unemployed, see them back into work, and the return of those workers, high skilled workers who are actually quite comfortable at home at the moment, is really important if we're going to see those other people return back to work. And again, that has issues in terms of inequality and making sure that the recovery is coming along, or everyone is being brought along with the recovery. That, of course, gets us back to a position where we were in March 2020, 12 months ago. Cast your mind back there. And if you cast your mind back to that point, we were having discussions about how we needed to level up the economy, how it was very uneven, cities v towns, and all of that debate. The question then is just returning back to the March 2020 position is not a satisfactory position for a lot of parts of the country. And again, going back to what Andy said at the start, the issue here is around productivity in particular, and about trying to make places outside the Great Southeast more productive, which puts more money in people's pockets. So hopefully their standards of living are higher, but also means they make a bigger contribution to the national economy too. But it's also about trying to push on these places, particularly big cities, again, that punch well below their weight in terms of productivity, which has implications not just for those big cities in terms of Manchester or Birmingham, but actually for Greater Manchester, for the West Midlands, or actually even the broader West Midlands or the broader Northwest. And it's not unless we crack that challenge about the underperformance of those big places will we see a real turnaround in terms of the performance of the North and Midlands, and indeed the government achieving its levelling up agenda. Now, of course, that opens up to all sorts of questions about economic priorities v political priorities, which may or may not overlap, but I'm sure we can get into more of that in the questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much indeed, Paul. Thank you again all to our panelists for their really interesting thoughts. I'm going to dive straight in, start with you, Andy, and pick up this point that you started with, which is about the recognition that economics and politics can be, and in many instances should be, different. Just say something about whether you think the wedge between those has kind of grown over time, and what that means for them when we think about how we help our places recover.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. And I think it's important because I think we often don't think enough about how those two things come together. I mean, we've got lots of really good thinking on both sides. But I think, and I think particularly in the sort of recovery from COVID, I think we will see the kind of politics becoming kind of slightly sharper. It reminds me actually quite a lot of the run up to the referendum, and obviously lots of those issues still kind of lots of the drivers of that vote still exist, and are still very well kind of managed politically, and by that I mean kind of the line we can draw from sort of vote leave in the referendum through the Conservative manifesto in the 2019 election. There are a set of campaigns that have done quite well speaking to and about particular places. But I think kind of thinking about the place point specifically and the politics of place, it reminds me of the referendum in the sense that kind of I think the politics of recovery will be seen through a local lens. So that kind of comes back to Julia's point in particular, and we may well see a return to that same the same moment in which was also, I've already mentioned Annan Menon once, the same moment when he was campaigning up in your neck of the woods, or not campaigning, he was at a seminar, and someone said, "That's not our bloody GDP." I think in other words, people will look at the recovery and they will judge whether it's being successful or quick enough by what they see locally in their part of the world, whether that's kind of a big city or a sort of an outlying town or region or whatever. So I think the politics get sharper. And I think our interest collectively, from whatever angle we're all coming from, needs to anticipate that. And I think we really need to think about kind of how we're knitting together the short-term politics as well as kind of the things that we know are going to take a long time to either build or to renew in kind of lots of different ways. Yeah,
Julia, come to you. I mean, how do you the tensions sometimes between the politics and the economics, how does that play out then on the ground when you're trying to operationalize and make decisions about recovery?
think it's, you know, it's the politics, it's the economics, but also I think it's just some of the institutional culture as well that you've just got to work through. So I think there are multifaceted things that you've got to try and work through in the relationships, and that's why you just can't underestimate how much time you need to invest in them. I think for me, what's interesting, kind of getting beyond the just a place-based approach, is like, where is there common cause, and how do we, how does that battle, how do those battles play out, or not, you know, or even just those conversations, they might not be battles. So for me, it'd be really interesting to see how the new cohort of mayors, for example, choose not to work together to raise some of this agenda, because there is a fundamental point for me, which is, you know, our cities and city regions are going to be an absolutely central plank of future recovery. They are pretty much kind of absent from the debate at the moment from a government point of view. How is that going to play out? How do, like, who and how is that kind of conversation going to progress and be supported? So it's as much about how are key cities and core cities and mayoral combined authorities going to come together to decide on what they agree on, as much as kind of continue to push on where there are points of difference.
Yeah, very good. Kate, how do the politics and the economics play out in a place like Burnley? Is there much difference, and if there is, how does that get resolved?
I suppose there's sort of two levels of this for us, and I think, you know, at a local level, at a district level, we've never been through as much political changes in decades as we have in the last couple of years, and it's been challenging, it's been interesting and challenging, but at the end of the day, I think politicians of all political persuasions have their place first and foremost, and you know, delivering a good outcome for people in their place. How they go about it might be different, how they prioritize might be slightly different. I think, you know, what we've seen is probably a different approach to risk, and how, you know, our approach to doing things. I think, you know, you mentioned city regions. The whole concept of city region has always been difficult for us in Lancashire. You know, we're not a polycentric, we don't have a centre to form around. Lancashire is a collection of, you know, relatively small towns and cities, all very proud of their own place, all with very difficult politics. And that has been difficult for us to fit into that kind of prescribed mould of what a city region should be like, what a combined authority should be like. And it probably reflects where we're at in that place. Although, you know, I think over the last 12 months, we've probably made a lot of progress on that. And you know, the COVID pandemic's given us something to rally around. But as you've said, that now seems to be slightly off the agenda, or if it is still on the agenda, no one's quite clear where it fits. As you say, it is largely absent in that new plan for growth.
Yeah, no, quite. That is a good point, and actually connects to. We've had several questions on this. They frame them in slightly different ways, but let me frame it in the way that's probably easiest from my point of view is, and you're going to need to put yourself in the mind of government to do this. So the question is, why is government doing what it's doing in the way that it's doing it? And what I mean by that is, you know, you've all referenced this sort of, you know, industrial strategy has been scrapped. New pots of competitive money have been reallocated. We don't know where they are on devolution. You know, plan for growth is not really a plan, not really about growth. So why are they doing what they're doing? You know, what is it that we think that they're trying to do? And I'm conscious that at least two of my panelists have been inside, so don't swerve it and, you know, and avoid the question. Otherwise, you know, come on, what's the point of being on a panel? But before, I'm gonna hold on to my two insiders first. Paul, give me your view on why is government doing what it's doing in the way that it's doing.
I was hoping you were going to ask the insiders.
I know
first,
you.
Might be
I know. But, you know, come on.
So I mean, they've got an election to win, haven't they? I think is the short answer. And I think the politics of this is where the economics and the politics come together. And that clearly, I think sort of MPs, certainly in the areas that Conservative MPs that have been elected in the last election, areas that hadn't been elected before, need to have something to go to the ballot box next time, or manifesto to go and campaign on and say, look, we've done this for you. It appears as if a lot of the decisions that are being announced are guided by that. But of course, far be it from us to say that, but certainly others have suggested and pulled out sort of some interesting selection criteria that is being used. I think there's a bit of an interesting disconnect, which again Andy alluded to earlier, which is in the plan for growth on page 75. I can tell you, for those who are interested, there's actually a very nice piece about the role of big cities in the national economy, and why getting Manchester, Glasgow, and Birmingham firing again is crucial to the future performance of the UK economy, which we completely agree with. Almost centre of the cities could have written those lines, the way that they were crafted. But if you look at the outcomes that we've had announced so far, beyond pot of money for transport spending within the big cities, all of it is geared towards smaller places. Now, as Andy says, that might be the right thing to do in terms of, if you have got a big department store which is pulled out of a place and it looks really ugly, doing something to try and change that may be a good thing to do from how good people feel about where they live or their perceived standards of living. But in terms of trying to address levelling up, we're not going to be able to do that until we tackle the big city issue. And I think it seems if the government is thinking about the smaller town issue, but hasn't got an answer to the big city issue yet. And it's okay to do the former, but it can't be done in the absence of not doing the latter.
Okay, very good. Julia, why are they doing what they're doing in the way that they're doing it? Tell us.
I think there might be three things. So obviously there's the politics, but outside of that, you can't not mention Treasury orthodoxy, I think, basically, the kind of institutional mindset. I would say that, I suppose just in terms of being kind and thinking about it, government has been trying to respond to an absolutely unprecedented crisis on top of all the stuff they were trying to do on Brexit. And the instinctive response in that situation is to grip really, really tightly. It might not be the sensible thing to do, but that is absolutely a kind of understandable and human reaction. I think the challenge is, at what point does that tip over from being a kind of an acute response into a chronic one and become much, much more of a problem? And then I suppose the third thing, just there is a lot of fuzziness around levelling up. And I think ironically, that's probably because central government itself is quite devolved. So it's an absence of strength of the centre of government that I think is also not helping. So I think it's a combination of those things, plus obviously the personalities and the politics, which is where we are right now. It doesn't fit. I'm not sure that we're completely settled in that place yet. There is stuff still to play out, but I think it's quite a challenging place at the moment.
Yeah, no, quite. Andy, give us your what's the cunning plan that we're not aware of that the government has, in the way that they're strategically figuring all of this stuff out, and we just wait to be told.
We always think there's a cunning plan, or I think in this government's case, a coming plan. But that kind of that always worries me, because when I was inside it, kind of it was never quite as detailed as people assumed it was. Obviously I agree with Paul and Julia. Politics is absolutely part of it. This is still a government that knows how to campaign more than it knows how to govern. I think Julia's point about Treasury orthodoxy is absolutely spot on. I think we shouldn't forget the sort of, this government is still pretty new and inexperienced. It doesn't know what levers it's got, and they're still getting used to kind of pulling different ones and finding that some do things and others don't. And I think the third thing is that it just yet hasn't got to the place where it knows what it wants from local government. Before Christmas, when Simon Clarke was still a minister, we were expecting kind of, devolution and kind of a white paper and combined authorities and more mayors and all the rest of it. And then that's come to a shuddering halt. I think in reality, I'm of the view that, you can't turn around places, you can't do recovery unless you've got strong local institutions and well-funded local government. I suspect central government, still has a similar view about local government as it does about kind of benefits claimants, i.e. you can't trust them to spend on the things that you want them to spend on, and they're gonna sort of spend it on silly stuff like shopping centres or local papers or possibly even airports, and so they can't yet move out of that mindset that says we should fund local government well to manage these things, or we should devolve to new kind of tiers of local government in order to kind of really let these issues kind of rip. The positive angle is that you know, they might get that, they might learn that that is the right thing to do. But at the moment, far too much of it is, you know, we will control and design and then kind of drip it out in the form that we want to see the money spent. And you know, there are a myriad of problems with that, as others have already sort of spelled out.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. That gives us a hope, at least, that as they learn, like other governments learn over their lifetime about what they can and can't do, that they eventually get to these things, often unfortunately a little bit too late, but that's a different story. Okay, I'm not going to get you to comment on this, but I want to come back with a couple of questions or to you, and in particular in relation to your point about, you know, what the opportunities are if working patterns change. You know, you were sort of touching on, you know, if Manchester's working patterns change, does that have a benefit for Burnley? And the question really is, what would you need? What are you going to do differently, or what will you need to do differently in order to capture some of that gain? So if those patterns and blended working patterns change, people less time in central offices, more at home, or more elsewhere, what will you do in Burnley as a result of that? And Julia, that's probably a relevant question for you in the kind of West Mids area as well, about, you know, Wolverhampton vis-a-vis central Birmingham, vis-a-vis Solihull, vis-a-vis Walsall, and so on and so on. And so I'll come to you, but Kate, kick us off.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a continuation of a longer term strategy that we've had, and, you know, probably going back, you know, when I first went to work in Burnley, which is 15 years ago now, we realised that actually we couldn't sustain ourselves as a place on its own, and actually places like Manchester and Leeds and Preston increasingly are important to us, and that actually we needed very strong links to them economically. And over the, you know, the last decade, we've improved our transport infrastructure into Manchester with direct rail link. Our last local plan was very much about planning for some housing growth, linked to the fact that, you know, you had an opportunity to commute in and out of Manchester. So, you know, that is part of a longer term plan. We still need better connectivity to those places. I think if people are going to move to that kind of blended working, we need better digital connectivity. You know, we're at the bottom of the queue for every kind of ultra fast broadband. I'm not even sure where we're up to now, which G version we're on, but we're not there. And the other one is skills. I always come back to skills and education, because if people are able to live in places like Burnley and commute into those big cities, they need a skill set where they can be competitive in those markets, and that has to be a key one for us. We've been doing some work over the last probably 4 or 5 years with the University of Central Lancashire around bringing a whole East Lancashire campus into Burnley, which is really around our drive around higher level skills. But underneath that, we have a long ongoing tail issue of underattainment in our schools, and actually a one-off pot of money from levelling up or whatever is not going to address that issue. There is a fundamental issue there around our education system, which we just don't seem to be able to crack. And then, you know, the last 12 months we've had, you know, kids at home completely removed from the education system, and what is the longer term impact of that closure of schools on that generation of young people and their ability to you know, stay and live here and access jobs in some of those big city regions. And if, going back to Paul's point, if there is a focus on those city region, the growth of those big cities, then it needs to fundamentally address how other places relate and plug into it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. Julia, I mean, as the potential, the possibility of different ways of working, how is that sort of played through then into how you think about the different bits of the West Midlands and how they work with each other and interrelate? How has your thinking changed over the last 12 months?
So I think in the same kind of vein as Kate, I think actually being a polycentric region rather than a monocentric one is an opportunity. So it's how do we work together to make the most of that? I think what we are still working through is like, what does that mean for how some of the travel to work area dynamics have changed, not just within the region, but kind of outside of the region and with other places too. So we've got to work through all of that. I mean, it does raise some really, really fundamental, like existential issues about our investment plan. So we've got really, really big transport infrastructure investment plans, but the whole basis to that, like how we finance that, is completely under, you know, the big question marks there. So there's some challenges as well as opportunities there. And then just the final thing that I'd say on that is some really interesting work, in addition to the great work that kind of places are leading about their own cities and towns, some really interesting common threads on thinking more in the short term around how do we reanimate our places. It's that combination of like how people will move back to the offices because the office absolutely isn't dead. How do we encourage people? How do we make them feel safe to come back into our city centres and town centres too? So it's not just about the hard physical infrastructure, it's also the softer stuff that's going to be so important.
Yeah, no, quite. Andy, obviously, you know, you're from Wolverhampton, but you work in Manchester. So, I mean, it's a similar issue. Well, it's a similar issue in lots of our kind of bigger conurbations, because they are one conurbation on the one hand, made up of lots of different places. In the previous model, or, you know, the way that it worked out, agglomeration, you know, was a factor. Has that gone away? I mean, do you see that? How do you see that playing out? I get Paul to kind of comment on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it has gone away. I don't think offices are dead, and I don't think city centres are. But I think, you know, Paul posed the right question, which is kind of, you know, to what extent will people come back to shop and to work in offices? I think, I mean, I think the key to this is the sort of the higher earning, more autonomous workers who've got more choice and spend more. You know, what will they do because they've got the kind of, you know, the personal kind of purchase in the labour market to make those decisions? And if they say, I'm only coming back 2 days a week to the office, or 3 days, you know, that eventually kind of has a big impact. It also has a big impact on places, because the big worry here is that, you know, is that those centres, those outlying places, wherever they happen to be, the ones that are going to do well out of this are the ones that have got more of those workers, because you know, they then shift that spending and that time to those places. And again, those aren't or they are much less likely to be the Wolverhamptons or the Oldhams, you know, or the Burnleys. So you know, I think that's likely to exacerbate gaps rather than kind of solve them. But yeah, one to watch.
Yeah. Paul, your kind of final thoughts on this. We're getting close to 12 o'clock. So your thought on this, how the economic geography of places and the economic geography between places is evolving and changing?
So the reason why we've seen a growth in high skill jobs in city centres in recent years has been because of the value of face-to-face interaction that you get within city centres. So the ability to have sort of spontaneous interactions, to learn from one another, you know, push on sort of your career and push on organisations as a result. I don't say that COVID changes that. You know, if we feel comfortable from a health perspective, from a safety perspective of going back in, it feels to me that companies will be looking to try and still to get workers to come in and do that. And have that face-to-face interaction, because Zoom is great, but it still doesn't replicate what you get in terms of face-to-face. Now, the question is that 3 days a week or is it 5 days a week? And we don't know. That's what we'll be interested in to look at the data. Indeed, we will be over the coming weeks and months. I think if we assume that is therefore going to be the place, the issue about agglomeration in the UK is that it very clearly happens in London, but it doesn't happen to the extent it should be in the other big cities. And that's why, you know, the Midlands of the North and Scotland underperform in the way they do. That's why the UK as a whole underperforms relative to how both cities and countries elsewhere in Europe perform. And that's what we need to get right. Now, that isn't a city v towns argument. That is, different places have different potential, which means we have will require different policy interventions. But we also shouldn't be expecting, you know, quite small places all of a sudden to become the centre of remote investment banking, because that's not going to happen, you know, realistically. It's about thinking about what smaller places can do, how do we improve life there, and what should we expect in bigger cities, and how to get them to make a bigger contribution than what they have done in the last 20 or 30 years.
Great, thank you very much indeed. It's certainly a session that could definitely carry on and run and run. We have hundreds of questions. I have hundreds of questions, but unfortunately it's 12 o'clock. And so the discipline of being the chair means that we have to come to a finish. Thank you to my superb, brilliant panel, Andy, Julia, Kate, and Paul. Brilliant insights in the first instance, and then great responses to some really good questions. Thanks always to Policy at Manchester for working with us on this series of events. Thanks to everybody posing their questions, much appreciated. We didn't get through but 1% of them, but I appreciate them nevertheless. You'll find the recording of this event if you want to see it again on our event, and all previous events. You can find them on our website, centreforcities.org. Our next event is next Monday at around 1:15, or indeed it's not around, it's dead on 1:15. And we'll be launching a big new report we've been working on, which is looking at the job creation challenge facing the country over the next decade or so. So we'll have some interesting insights to share with you on Monday around lunchtime. Hope to see many of you there. But until then, take care and stay safe. Thank you very much for being with us today. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.